Welcome to The Big Unlock, where we discuss data, analytics, and emerging technologies in healthcare. Here's some of the most innovative thinkers in healthcare information technology talk about the digital transformation of healthcare and how they are driving change in their organizations.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast, The Big Unlock. And this is Paddy, and it is my great privilege and honor to have as my special guest today, Greg Silvesti, Head of Digital Health and Innovation for AbbVie. Greg, welcome to the show.
Hey, Paddy, thanks for having me today.
You're most welcome. So, Greg, for those who may not know AbbVie and AbbVie's history, of course, the blockbuster drug that drives most of AbbVie, do you want to share a little bit of background and overview of the company before we launch into our conversation today?
Yeah, absolutely. Would be happy to. So, I think most people, know AbbVie as the Humira company, as it's oftentimes referenced to. But AbbVie's a company that's been, has split out from Abbott about 5 years ago. And is a company that obviously is really founded around Humira and is really a big driver of where the company's gotten to over the last 5 years. But, it's a company that's really diversified now. And so when you begin to look at our portfolio, really we're major players across immunology, women's health, oncology. So it's really an exciting company to be at because, again, while we're known for Humira, there's a lot happening across the portfolio, being a company that is still only 5 years old, being independent. And then on top of that, of course, what's most exciting about it is all the innovation and the areas that we are now getting into in the digital health space as well.
That's awesome. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I know that AbbVie has a venture capital arm that's been making a number of investments also in this space. And we'll hopefully be able to talk a little bit about that and what the investment philosophy is and how it drives digital. But to begin with, what does digital really mean in the context of a company like AbbVie and in general to the pharma sector? Do you want to maybe share a few thoughts on that first?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's one that I get asked a lot. And, it's one of those things now, having been at multiple companies and being in digital health and innovation roles, people often, the first question you always get is, so what is it? What is our digital health strategy? What is it going to be? And the first thing I like to tell people is that digital health isn't a strategy, right? It's an enabler to an overall strategy. It's just another tool that we have to really unlock value and to think about strategically. Every company looks at what they want to be different. And depending on what you want to do at let's say a corporate level, at a commercial level, at a development level, you then look at your enabling technologies and what you can do from a digital standpoint, and those things should help you ladder up back into what your overall strategy is. And so really digital means different things to different companies, right? For some companies within pharma, it's simply about enabling the development of molecules more efficiently or effectively in a clinical trial through, whether it's just simply being able to measure things objectively in a better way in a setting where, where patients actually live and work in ways that are meaningful for them. It can be actually thinking about developing a digital therapeutic to replace a molecule. Or it can be some sort of combination in between, right? And so I think, again, it all ladders back up to what does a company want to be, and then building your approach to digital with those enabling technologies that way.
Right. That's very interesting. So from what you said, the focus areas as far as digital strategies are concerned in pharma are maybe a little bit different from that of, let's say, a health system or a hospital. Because in the context of hospitals, health systems, or even health insurance companies, we hear a lot about patient engagement or caregiver enablement as the big focus area, telehealth and whatnot. You just mentioned drug discovery, which seems to be a big focus area for pharma. So in that sense, is there a fundamental difference between let's say, pharma and other sectors within healthcare as it relates to approaching digital?
Yeah, I don't necessarily know if it's different. I think they're complementary. And what I mean by that is when you think about what everybody is doing within digital, right? It's all about sort of a shift in terms of where the focus of power is moving towards, right? And we're trying to put more of that focus back on the patients. And when you think about things around engagement, right? What does it always come down to? Whatever it is we're trying to do within digital, it's around outcomes, right? And we're essentially at the end of the day trying to make people healthier, trying to improve outcomes, and ultimately, right, if we want to break it down, like how do we take costs out of the system, right, across the board? And so I think that's where you get a lot of that overlap. And I think what's important about that, particularly when you think about some of the strategies that come out of pharma, is if you look at the changing dynamics within the payer landscape and whatnot, a lot of these things are becoming cost of entry now. So if you're not coming with a digital product or a digital solution along with a molecule, you're actually putting yourself behind the eight ball a little bit. And what I mean by that is let's just take a look at biologics and drug delivery right now. So if you think about that space, right, we are moving into a world where a lot of the focus is being shifted onto the patient in terms of a lot of these new biologics are, large injections, they're viscous, and a lot of them are now happening in the home. And our efficacy, right, is based off of how well people can actually take these injections, as an example, which is then also tied to our reimbursement. And so based off of that, we need to have tools in place so we can actually understand how people are using our products and to actually enable the best experience that they can. Because in these areas where you're seeing, kind of essentially commoditization of molecules and kind of dancing on a pinhead for differentiation of new products sometimes, that experience is going to be the differentiator between how effective your product is and tied to, again, if you're looking at different risk share models or some of these new emerging reimbursement strategies, being able to have that tie into an ecosystem with digital is going to be critical.
So you're almost saying that digital enablement is almost like table stakes for entry and for remaining competitive in the marketplace in some ways. Is that correct?
I would definitely say that, and I think you're already seeing that, right? So obviously, in some chronic areas, right, you can point to diabetes and say it is essentially cost of entry at this point, and you can clearly see as you're starting to look at other chronic areas, particularly where there's a lot of costs, right? That's where you're starting to see most of the inroads with it, right? So it's all around hypertensive, obesity, non-compliance, diabetes, asthma. Those are really the areas where it's ripe and it's becoming just simply cost of entry.
Right. That's very interesting. So that indicates a level of maturity in the marketplace as well. So you mentioned digital therapeutics. So can you talk a little bit about what kind of initiatives are the near-term focus areas for AbbVie, and how are you really going about harnessing in your role the innovations that are available in the marketplace, either through the startup ecosystem or through partnerships or even through internal initiatives? Can you talk a little bit about how AbbVie is approaching it?
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely looking at things from a buy, borrow, build perspective, right? We're not locked into one particular strategy in terms of thinking about digital. Now, the thing that we are doing, right, is I think if you look at the digital space, it's matured a lot in the last, let's even say, 3 years. And so I think where the shift has sort of happened and where we're going with things is that, a couple years ago, it was all about the sensor, right? And everybody was fascinated by just the data that could come off of the sensor. And what we've seen very quickly is that there's not value in data. And so what I mean by that is there was that period where just simply being able to capture transactional metrics off of a single sensor, everybody thought there was going to be tremendous value in that. And now where we've gotten to, and I think because of it, is the commoditization of the tech is we can measure most things, right? So we're not so much enamored by the technology anymore, but we're more thinking about these sensors as enablers to a broader intervention, right? And so the approach that we're taking is actually one that is agnostic of technology. So our whole strategy starts without talking about technology. It's again all around what are we solving and bringing a lot of elements of design thinking and co-creations with our patients into the process to really again understand what is meaningful to them, what are the constraints for that patient population to ensure if we are going to be bringing some sort of digital technology in that it actually works right from an experience standpoint. And then again, if that's laddering back up into what our overall strategy is. So the biggest thing that we've been doing is trying to get people out of the mindset of being so enamored by the widget and focused on the actual technology and more around the problem and what we're solving, and then working backwards into what is that ultimate, perfect solution going to be for that patient population or whatnot. And that's where we get into then at that point thinking about buy, borrow, build, right? Is there something that is off the shelf that is perfect for us to a company for us to partner on, or is there maybe somebody that has about 50%, 60% of the way there that we can partner and get them, that extra 50%, so we're in a good place to be able to leverage that technology.
So that's an interesting observation you make, that the technology by itself is not something you want to be enamored with to a point where that is the end. You're really using technology to drive new experiences, new ways of doing things. And, some might argue that the whole technology first, or to put it another way, build it and hope they will come kind of a mindset is not really going to work in healthcare. At the same time, the technology is an important enabler, right? Using the technology to accelerate innovation or to reimagine the way you engage with patients or reimagine your different processes in your value chain also is important. So it looks like, you're in your strategy of buy, borrow, build, you're definitely, it seems, looking into the ecosystem for interesting technologies that can help drive your digital journey or digital strategy. Can you talk a little bit about specifically what are the things you look for when you go into the market, and what are the things that you feel like you're best off doing internally?
Yeah, so we take an approach of thinking about digital from the standpoint is that there's short-term needs and then there's going to be long-term, right? And so our approach, again, is grounded in what we're solving. And the reason we do that is because if you don't take that approach and you get more enamored on the technology, what you end up happening is getting stuck in a world where everything is an app. And what I would challenge people is to think about right now, everything is we're very much tied to screens, right? And so inherently, when we think about solutions, we say, well, people sort of use saying I need an app as a way for talking about a digital strategy, right? Much like we call a Kleenex or Xerox, things like that, right? We get focused in on a particular thing that means something actually much bigger. And so what we try to do is, again, getting people out of thinking about apps and thinking about the problem, because, I really think screens are going to be going away in the next couple of years. When you start to look at the trends of zero UI and what, a lot of companies are doing in terms of, Apple and Google and Amazon, and talking about trying to get your phone essentially into your ear, right? They're calling them hearables. But then also looking at how we're all guinea pigs every time we put our AirPods in or we're talking to an Echo, right? We're all sort of moving towards this reality of not actually using screens. And so, what our approach has been is understanding for our, let's just take an example for someone, let's say with Parkinson's, understanding in the short term, what does good look like for them, and what sort of technologies can we bring in to, let's say, either better assess disease progression or look at things in terms of, clinical tests that happen actually outside of the clinic in the short term, but then also thinking about, again, the constraints of that patient population and things that they may have from some physical limitations and whatnot, dexterity and whatnot, and think about ways that we can totally change that engagement. And so a lot of that involves thinking about what are your patient-reported outcomes and things, and then trying to identify emerging technologies that we can partner with and say, are there ways that we can actually, validate these PROs and get in that sort of futuristic world that we like to be in. The other challenge I would say, and something we talk about often, is beyond screens going away, is PROs and clinical trials going away. And can we get to a world where everything is truly passively collected? And so that when you kind of think about those two worlds, it'll help you develop a roadmap that gives you short term within the next 2 to 3 years what you do, but then also your longer term vision in terms of partnerships and some of these emerging zero UI technologies and whatnot.
That's again another interesting observation, and so there's obviously implications for both the consumer of these technologies and also for those who are developing these technologies. So, as we all know, there's billions and billions going into funding innovative startups, and and many of them don't make it, right? And I've read stats from IQVIA and others that say that there's more than 150,000 mobile apps out there in the Apple and the Droid stores, but a very, very small number are actually being used meaningfully. If you go by the number of downloads and so on. So if we are moving towards an environment where it is, let's say, screenless and it's a zero UI environment, how do these innovative startups find a place in the world? Are they all going to have to eventually converge on a handful of devices that become the gateway now to managing the patient experience, like an iPhone, for instance, or an Echo, Amazon Echo? Where do we think we are headed with this?
Yeah, I don't think it's particularly zeroing in on a particular technology or a few technologies. I think the challenge with a lot of these startups has been they've taken almost a consumer approach to the technology, and what I mean by that is when you look at a lot of companies, from my perspective, that have failed or are struggling, they have some interesting technology that they're then trying to essentially figure out a healthcare problem for, right? So they're actually attacking the issue backwards, which is more of that sort of, commercial Silicon Valley sort of approach, right? Where we have something interesting and let's see if we can actually figure out a way to implement it in a way that's meaningful for folks, right? And so in healthcare, I think that it doesn't work, right? And I think that's where you're seeing the challenges, and we've always seen the challenges, is that a lot of these startups don't have a good understanding of healthcare and healthcare systems and just workflows and actually how healthcare gets delivered. On the other side of the world, which is always a challenge, is a lot of people within pharma can't speak the same language as a lot of these startups. And so because of that, I think you've seen a lot of these companies that are failing. And so do I think we're going to get stuck into, to your question, a world of just simply an Echo or an iPhone? Like, no, because again, in a world of let's keep moving down. So right now it's an app, and then it's going to go towards some sort of zero UI, but probably after that, it's going to move towards an implantable, right? Or something like that. And so again, in that sort of scenario, it's not about the technology. It's about, are we solving the right problem? And then the solution that we're adopting is going to evolve. And, an example of that I always like to give is if you're starting a new job, right? Same sort of thing when it comes to technology development. And your first day, let's say you don't know the area where your office is, which obviously you would if you've already interviewed there, but let's just hypothetically say you don't know where you're going, right? If you start your new job in 1985, the solution and the product you're going to adopt is going to be a map, right? But as you move on, if you start your job in, let's say, 1995, right, it's probably going to be, or later on than that, it's going to be, you're not going to select the map anymore. You're going to select MapQuest and print out your directions. And then it's going to be a GPS that's on your dashboard. Then it's going to be, Waze, and then it's going to be a self-driving car. And it's all these sorts of things, right? So you can see fundamentally, we can't articulate what the technology is going to be, but it's the same problem exists. And so we just need to stay grounded in that problem and let the technology evolve.
Interesting. So 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 I want to talk a little bit about your investment portfolio, right? I mean, AbbVie Ventures, you've made a bunch of investments, you've made some strategic partnerships with. So what's been the philosophy behind these investments? What are you looking for from these entities?
Yeah, so it's I think it's evolving as well, right? So I think the area that it's evolving more and more is around the digital space. And so, we've got some well-known partnerships out there, particularly with Calico and things that we're working on there, which has been really successful. And I think, where we're at is we have a pretty clearly defined approach to digital in terms of some of our emerging core therapeutic areas that we want to be in. And so now what our approach has been is actually, again, thinking about both short term and long term. And so what I would say around our approach is we're thinking about the next 3 to 5 years in terms of what we need to deliver, but then also hopefully going to be placing some bets on what that more future vision for digital and what AbbVie is going to look like in terms of partnerships from, small startup companies, academia, consortiums, and then, some other, let's say, potentially bigger technology investments as well. So we're sort of, again, all over the map in a way, but it's sort of focused in a manner, if that makes sense, meaning short-term to long-term priorities.
Yeah. So one of the things that, and I want to go back to your earlier comment about zero UI technology, and I think the example of the self-driving car, going from a map to a self-driving car that knows where it needs to go, and all you do is provide an address, for instance, that's all powered by a lot of AI technologies, right? So it's looking at a lot of data, it's learning on its own, it's making sure that it's not making any mistakes, optimizing for the routes, et cetera, et cetera. So where does now AI is a much hyped term, but there's also some reality to it. Where do you feel that fits in your overall strategy? Do you look at AI as something that you want to invest in as an entity, or are you looking at your partners to sort of infuse their technologies and their products and platforms with inbuilt AI functionality? So it's to your earlier term, it's kind of like table stakes, the cost of entry. Where do you see that in the overall spectrum of expectations?
Yeah, so for us, it's hand in hand, right? When we think about a digital strategy, that's certainly a component of it, right? So we can call it, we can call it AI, we can call it whatever we want to call it, but at the end of the day, again, if you're thinking about, as we talked about earlier, that evolution, right, from 2015 being about data and 2018 and 2019 being about actionable information, the only way you get there is through analysis, right? And so let's call it AI, but we have now these disparate data streams that are coming off of these sensors, right? So these are the enablers that in isolation don't provide any value. When you're able to look at those things in combination and actually make sense of it, right, that's when you are able to get to actionable information. And that is ultimately where the value within digital is, right? And then I think we're seeing that evolution, and what that does when you're able to do that analysis and get meaningful information out of these sensors, then it opens up everything for you, right? It opens up that ecosystem. It opens up all those areas of intervention that you can make. And it goes from a reality that takes you from passively tracking to then actually being proactive in terms of interventions and actually, engagement, right? And that's ultimately where we want to get to. So yeah. I think whatever we want to call it, it's actually what is really the anchor to what's going to be the future of digital, and if digital is really going to work.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So now, what are the top 2 or 3 challenges in making all this come together? With data, of course, we know that in healthcare there's a problem with interoperability. There are no defined standards, especially in the context of exchanging electronic health record information, as an example. But what do you think are going to be the biggest challenges to making this vision a reality, or getting to where you think you need to be for AbbVie?
Yeah, I think it's always interesting having now been at a handful of large pharma and med device companies. The challenges are always the same, but a little bit different, right? And I think one of the biggest ones, particularly within pharma, is pharma moves at a certain pace and technology moves at a certain pace, right?
Hmm.
And we know that those are not similar, right? So pharma is much more plodding and straightforward, right? Where trying to marry up timelines between what you're doing within pharma and the tech is always going to be a challenge. Now, I
Hmm.
think with some of the stuff that the FDA is doing, it's starting to or attempting to bridge that, and I'm hopeful that those sorts of interventions are going to help us be more nimble moving forward in terms of digital combination products and whatnot. So I think there are some potential solutions there. But to me, the biggest challenge is inherently pharma needs to change what it thinks it does. And so for a lot of pharma companies, they are a drug company or they think of themselves as a drug company. And the challenge I would say across the board is that when you take a look outside of the four walls of your company, you're really an outcomes company. And when you begin to think of yourselves as an outcomes company, your competitive set opens up, and what you're trying to accomplish opens up as well. And so, trying to make that shift in mindset from an industry like pharma is a challenge. And what comes along with that is, as we talked about before, right? Different skill sets and ways of thinking and experiences. And so, those are all just I think things that are right now a lot of companies are trying to evolve into, but I think it's that shifting mindset into solutions and outcomes versus product and molecule.
Interesting. So what's the definition of success then in your role?
Yeah, so I think for us, it's really two things, right? So I think we want to look at, like most companies, digital that can enable the drug development process, right? So how can we take friction out of the system? When you think about clinical trials, there's so many areas that are ripe for just improvement, right? So that's one is ways that we can tangibly look at the ways we're doing trials and are we doing them better, right? Are we able to capture measures objectively? Are we able to take some of the PROs out? Are we able to reduce costs, increase probability for success of our trials? Those sorts of things, right? At the second time, it's about enabling commercial strategies, right? So things we talked about earlier around molecule plus some sort of digital solution to enable new partnerships with payer organizations or just open up some of these commercial opportunities that may not exist by simply having, a fantastic drug that works in isolation.
Right. Some of it is also driven by the expectations around demonstrating outcomes and demonstrating the value with all the scrutiny around the cost of drugs and so on and so forth. Is that what is also driving some of the digital strategy?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Right. That's part of it too, is when you have a fantastic product, you want to ensure that you can actually show in a real world that people are using it properly and the efficacy is there. So yeah, absolutely, that is part of it. And as we talked about, right, moving more and more towards table stakes in a lot of these chronic areas.
Yeah, yeah. So we're coming up to our time here. So my final question for you, Greg, is what's your advice to your peers in the industry, namely other chief digital officers in either pharma or other sectors of healthcare, and also to the solution providers? Let's recognize that there is a huge ecosystem that sees a huge opportunity for digital in healthcare, and there seems to be some amount of struggle in trying to make the correct connects and finding the right fit and ensuring that everybody is successful. So what's your advice to solution providers as well as to your peers?
Yeah, I think it's taking a step back, right, from the sexiness of the technology, which is where we all love to talk about, but taking that step back and saying, is everything truly grounded in an overall strategy, right? And thinking about digital as not a standalone component, but as we talked about, an enabler to that bigger strategy, right? In and of itself, it is not a strategy, it should enable whatever your company wants to be, whether it's an outcomes company, whether it's, whatever you want to call it. So that's number one, is don't think about it as this siloed, thing by itself, but thinking about it as it integrates with the bigger company. And I think the other part is, again, is it about outcomes and how it fits into the workflow, right? If you're not optimizing the process, if you're actually creating complexity, which a lot of these solutions currently are, with when you think about dashboards and everything else that we're asking physicians to log into, right, and all these other things.
Yeah.
If you're not optimizing the process, then you need to take a step back and think about how you can actually do that. So that is the biggest thing for me, is like it's about optimization. It's taking friction out of the system. And if you can look at what you're doing and we're not doing that, then we need to take a step back and think about how to do that.
Fantastic. Greg, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you. And thank you so much for sharing your insights on digital and what you're doing at AbbVie. Sounds like you got a lot of exciting things going on, and I wish you the very best with all of these initiatives. Thank you again for being on the show.
Absolutely, Paddy. Appreciate it, and hope to catch up soon.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. Subscribe to our podcast series at www.thebigunlock.com and write to us at info@thebigunlock.com.